Hello friends, and we're going to turn to interest groups. Interest groups are not political parties. They don't run candidates for elections. They are not political institutions that you find described in the Constitution. However, in the 21st century, they have a dramatic influence on American government and American politics, and that's why we're going to devote this section of our course to studying interest groups. The rise of interest groups has taken place basically from 1970 to the present day. There have always been, however, interest groups involved in campaigns and elections in American politics from the very beginning of our republic. So that's important to keep in mind. Having said that, interest groups have proliferated tremendously in recent American political life. Why? There are many reasons. Our country's become more complex. There's an interest for everything. There's approaching 10,000 registered interest groups in the United States. There's an interest group for every interest. And we're a diverse, wild, open country with many, many economic, political, social, and other types of interests. And there's probably an interest group to match any kind of interest that you own. I can say this with some assuredness because as a young man working in the U.S. House of Representatives, I was exposed to just how many and how great the significance of interest groups are. We had a staff member in the office in which I worked for the member of Congress, and his job was to follow the budget considerations, budget debates, that sort of thing, and to help advise the member of Congress how to vote on that particular budget proposal. Well, unfortunately, he was sick one day at one of the big budget votes of the year, and I had to fill in for him. And it was going to be a very close vote. It was highly contested, and the representatives of interest groups, which we'll see in a few moments, are called lobbyists. I was visited while I was filling in for my friend by 65 lobbyists, representing 65 interests, as diverse as the National Association of Manufacturers, which is an extremely large lobby group, extremely large interest group, and they represent Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. On the other extreme, we also had a visit from the Wisconsin Fur Traders Association, and they were concerned mainly with the regulation of the fur trade industry and the federal government's involvement in that. And it awakened me tremendously to just how powerful and how many interest groups there are in the United States. Interest groups basically serve two functions. Function number one, interest groups share information and research on their topic of interest or interests. So they're an information gathering and information disseminating organization. Function number two is to give money to campaigns of candidates who either support them or they hope in the future will support them. In this role, they function as what is called a political action committee, and they are regulated by the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC. So interest groups serve a necessary and important function. One great question in American politics among political scientists is that function too significant? Have they become, in other words, too powerful in American politics? And that's a very serious question. Keep in mind also we're a country of 50 states. There are interest groups in each state. Many state-based interest groups. Because there's some concerns in one state, they're not all that important in others. And you can imagine those kinds of situations. Also, we live in a time of the weakness or relative weakness of political parties in many ways. Therefore, interest groups kind of fill a void in terms of supplying information and mobilizing voters too. Many of the traditional functions that we associate with political parties. Interest group activity in American politics and American political life has not always been the same. Like I mentioned, from the beginning of the Republic, we had interest groups. About 70% of the interest groups that have been created since 1960, to give you some idea. That is a dramatic increase. In the early republic, we had groups that organized for independence from Great Britain. Those were interest groups. Those small groups of citizens that became larger groups of citizens, correspondence committees, those sorts of things. By the 1830s, 1840s, we had anti-slavery groups, we had pro-slavery groups, we had religious groups. Many of these were interest groups. By the 1860s, we have the sort of early origins of various kinds of unions of sorts, representing people who engage in particular kinds of labor, particular kinds of manufacturing. By the 1880s and 1890s, you have the growth of business affiliations that become interest groups. And from 1900 to 1920, you have the creation of many of the larger interest groups that we still have with us today. Interest groups can serve many functions, but mainly it's informational and influencing campaigns. Those are the two major functions. And there are different types of interest groups. We're going to talk about those in a moment. There are some who have a single interest. There are those who have many interests. Of course, we call a group with a single interest group, and a multi-interest group. So we have various kinds of interest groups. What are they like as organizations? Each interest group has what we might call an institutional goal. And some interest groups represent a diverse set of organizations. For example, one of the largest interest groups in the country is the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, the umbrella labor union and labor union interest group in the United States. They represent dozens of different kinds of unionized workers, from communication workers to electrical workers to various kind of workers. They're very diverse. On the other hand, one of the other largest lobby or interest groups in the United States is the National Rifle Association, NRA. They represent gun owners, and for the most part. And so they have more of a focused interest. Even though they're both very large, they can have very diverse interests. Almost every major business entity has an interest group or a political action committee, as it does every major corporation. Many of those corporations give strategically to both parties, which is also a very interesting consideration. Many government entities, especially government workers, state and local government workers and federal workers, have interest groups that represent themselves as well. Well, why do people join an interest group? What's the advantage of membership? If you apply for a credit card, if you apply for a membership in a social organization, that organization is probably going to spend a lot of time telling you why you should join, the advantages, why you cannot live without being a member of that group. Well, interest groups are somewhat the same way. They're benefits. The first reason that interest groups are so successful in the United States is that Americans are joiners. About 60% of Americans belong to two social, political, community groups. We'd love to join. When Alex de Tocqueville, the great French political observer of American politics, visited the United States in the early part of the 19th century, the mid part of the 1930s, 1830s, I believe. De Tocqueville said, boy, those Americans like to join groups. Now, I'm paraphrasing his French, but that's basically what he observes in his book, Democracy in America. Americans are joiners. Also, one of the advantages of joining is that we're part of a larger group than ourselves. I may not like a law that the state legislature makes or that Congress makes, but Lee Cheek running down to Atlanta, up to Washington, may be less than successful than if Lee Cheek is part of a larger group of folks expressing their concern about a particular government policy. Interest groups also give incentives. One of those is sort of what we call solitary incentives. The pleasure of joining a group that's doing some good. For example, I've had friends over the years that have been involved in NAACP, been involved in a particular interest that was very close to them. They felt like they were making the world a better place in their own way by being a member of that group, supporting that group, contributing to that group, and helping that group out in any way they could. Another advantage is a material one. Show me the money. Some interest groups represent your financial interests and your welfare, particularly if they're related to the kind of work that you do. Most teachers in this country are members of the state affiliate of the National Education Association, whose goal it is to promote and support public education. Many other professions are in a similar situation. Doctors, American Medical Association. Lawyers, American Bar Association. While many of these are both educational and professional organizations, they also many of these also have political action committees, so they serve both functions as we discussed. But some of these interest groups in the United States have very large staffs that do a great deal of work, sometimes even helping draft versions of bills for Congress to help members of Congress. And so this is a very important function of interest groups. Well, how are interest groups regulated? That's a great question. First of all, we're allowed to express our views thanks to the First Amendment. That's part of the Bill of Rights. So that's protected. However, Congress has seen fit over time to regulate the role of interest groups and the scope of interest groups. In 1946, for example, the federal government Congress passed, the president signed into law, a lobbying act, the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act, that limits the role that interest groups can play. In 1975, after Watergate, Congress passed even additional restrictions on interest groups that force them to formally register, and most states also have these registration requirements. Lobbyists have to say who they are, what groups they represent, who they meet with, who they give money to, which means they also have a disclosure requirement. They have to say who they give money to and how much money they've given. So the representatives of interest groups that we call lobbyists are the people who perform those roles. Various people become lobbyists, people who have expertise in a particular area, people who have an interest, people who have political clout, and one of the most prominent members of that group is former members of the House and former members of the Senate who still have the privilege of walking on the floor of the House and on the floor of the Senate, and they still have name recognition and public awareness of who they are. They can be very, very influential lobbyists, and this is often the case. That they move from Capitol Hill to K Street, which is one of the main locales of lobbyists. Please keep in mind that interest groups have to report, as I mentioned, who they give money to. They serve a diversity of causes and are a permanent part now of the American political landscape. An exercise that I would like you to embark on is to do your own research on an interest group. And that can be really any interest group of your choice. But I'd like you to ask a few questions. One, what is the name of the interest group? Two, what is the official function of the interest group? Number three, what do you think is the real purpose of the interest group? And four, how can they judge if they're effective? So really 4 characteristics. And I can give you a number of interest groups to begin to work on as a case study. This will be our journal entry for interest groups. The AMA, the American Medical Association, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the NEA, the National Public Teachers Organization. These are some ones that you can start to look at and to examine. Another one is PETA, P-E-T-A, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Go to their websites and try to answer those 4 questions. I'm really interested to see your response from your research. Thank you.